despite being scattered and partitioned at the Berlin Conference. Ultimately, you had to adhere to the new normal, as difficult and as confusing as it was to your people. The new normal came with its shortfalls, wrapped in wars, populism, division, exploitation, capitalism, poverty, just to name a few. The imposed laws and dramatic changes you had to deal with robbed you your dignity and so much more away from you. The new normal came with a high price to pay, of which debts you are still paying for till to date. You might never regain the dignity and the strong men and women you lost at the expense of trade, but your people are now reclaiming your power by creating household names for themselves globally. You might never recover economically, socially, and politically from being divided and partitioned, but your people are now more than ever fighting for unity and integration. Africa, you might never recover from being mentally crippled and made to believe that you are inferior, but you surely are making moves and changing the narrative one solution at the time. Dear Africa, this month we celebrate you regardless. Happy Africa Month. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ofensa, for that. Africa is endowed with talent, without a doubt. Ipileng, over to you to introduce Mr. Molobi.
Thank you so much, Mr. Makhalapa. I would like to take this opportunity to ask Mr. Mulubi, the CEO and Chairman of Brandhill Africa, to make welcome remarks. Mr. Mulubi, over to you.
Good morning, program directors, Ambassador Mpoko, the ambassador of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in South Africa, who also happens to be the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps resident in South Africa. All your excellencies present, and all the leadership of the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce, as led by the President, Mr. Piet du Toit, the Director of the Growth Diagnostics, in collaboration with the Northwest University Business School, who have been our #1 partner from the word-go since July last year when we started. Let me also thank my colleagues in the Brandhill Africa Group. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, you are all cordially welcomed. I thought I will share with you two screens. Let me see if I'll be able to do that. I think in the interest of time, I've been having technical glitches, so I may not be able to share with you these screens that I wanted to share with you, but later on I'll be able to share with you through email the 4 slides that I wanted to share with you. Let me open by paying homage to Thomas Sankara, the first post-independence president of Burkina Faso, who said, open quote, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from non-conformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future. It took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. I want to be one of those madmen. We must dare to invent the future." This for me also goes to what Steve Jobs, one of the co-founders of Apple, said. He said, this cohort of special leaders are crazy men because they drive the human race forward. And in 1990, the New Nation Writers Conference in Johannesburg, one of the guest speakers was the late Nawal El Sadawi, who passed on 6-7 weeks ago. She's from Egypt, and she said to us as young journalists, creativity starts with disobedience. Now, for that reason, I would say those of us who are connected both virtually through Zoom or we are watching this seminar through Facebook and YouTube or LinkedIn Live, I would say that we are one of those dreamers who are looking at reasserting Africa to its glorious past, where Africa is the cradle of civilization. So I'm now going to pause, and as usually when we have this bi-monthly seminars, I always regard myself as a commercial break in the interest of time by giving our distinguished speakers enough time to do their presentation. And where there's a break, I'll be able to chip in to say a word or two, just for us to be able to make sure that the streaming continues seamlessly. So for that reason, I'm going to hand over to the program directors and to continue with this event, where in case where one of the speakers may not be able to connect, I will be able to chip in and to say one or two more things that I was intending to say during the course of today. I'm saying this because I know our keynote speaker has to leave before 12 o'clock because he has a prior commitment. So for that reason, I would say, let me prioritize him over my commercial message as Brandhill Africa, which has been eloquently communicated by the Brandhill Africa Institute CEO, Mr. Stevens Mokhalapa. Thank you so much. Mr. Stevens Mokhalapa. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Molobi. Without further ado, it is indeed my distinguished pleasure to welcome the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador Ben Boko, the Ambassador of the Democratic Republic of Congo to South Africa, to share with us a few words in terms of and on behalf of the Diplomatic Corps of Africa in South Africa. Your Excellency, Ambassador Boko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and my brother Stephen Mokhalapa, CEO of Brandhill Africa Institute, all those present to this seminar, colleagues, ambassadors, and high commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. We are celebrating this month in order to reflect on where we came from, where are we today, and what's the way forward for our continent. We as Africans, we must be proud of who we are because we have contributed to development of the world. We Africans build Europe. We Africans build the United States of America and other parts of the world. Through our labor as slaves, we work very hard to build those countries, these parts of the world. We Africans contributed to the development of the planet through our natural resources because the continent is blessed, endowed with the natural resources that we know. My own country contributed to the development of the automobile industry, because when a car was invented in England, they lacked one major ingredient. They didn't have the tires to complete the invention of automobile. They were looking for natural rubber to make tires. And the natural rubber came from the place that was known at that time that had natural rubber was Congo. Later on, when they needed to invent the atomic bomb, they didn't have uranium. Uranium came from Congo. I can go on and on up to today. Africa is exporting to the world the very strategic minerals that you need for the modern technologies, including the invention of electrical cars, the cell phones, the satellites. All those inventions would not have been completed without raw materials coming from the continent of Africa. We are hardworking people, but what we lacked in the past was independence. So our forefathers fought, the Nkrumahs of this world, and so forth, the Lumumbas and the Nyereres. They fought to liberate us so we can be free. But now that we're free, are we moving forward? Are we standing still? It's important we move forward. And we have come out with the themes that were designed to move us forward economically, socially, and so forth. We started with the Lagos Plan of Action, but Lagos Plan of Action was never implemented. And then there was the Abuja Declaration, and then there was this and this and that. Today, we have the Agenda 2063. Now, we come out with all these themes, which theoretically they sound good, but are we implementing them? If not, why not? Today also somebody just now, a few minutes ago, mentioned the Africa Free Trade Area. We need to trade among ourselves. What are we going to be trading when we're not producing, adding value to our raw materials? What are we trading? Raw materials among ourselves? Shipping copper and cobalt and all those minerals? And no. We can have a trade area. It's just a space, a theory, but what are we actually trading among ourselves? Do we have the basic infrastructure, even we are not to ship those goods? Do we have the storage capacities? Do we have the necessary infrastructure? It's good to dream about these things, free trade, Africa free trade area, but we have to make sure we implement it by putting together the required tools for this trade actually to take place. One of the beginning places is to transform our raw materials locally. Why are we still exporting raw materials with a very small value added or no value added at all? And then when we import goods from outside, they come at a very high price tag. If today the cars, the electrical cars that are being manufactured with the contribution from Africa, especially our raw materials, when we want to buy those cars, we can't even afford them. So what stops us Africans to produce electrical cars on the continent? The person who, there are two individuals I'm going to name here. First one is a young lady, Dr. Sandrine Mubenga, who was declared in the United States in 2018 the Engineer of the Year in the entire US. Why? Because she invented the hybrid electrical car. She also advanced the technology that currently are producing batteries for electrical cars. But who is now the leading entrepreneur to produce the electrical cars? It's Elon Musk, a Pretoria born and raised boy, an African. So, which means I'm saying this to show that we have the capacity to do all that, to contribute to development of this country. What we need to start with to work together. The togetherness the Nkrumahs and the Lumumbas were promoting. Let's create the African Union so that we can work together. That was the purpose of creating the African Union. But instead of working together, we spend a lot of time fighting each other. That's why when President Ramaphosa took over as the head of the African Union, and today is the President Tshisekedi of the DRC, their main objective is to silence the guns on the continent. We spend a lot of time fighting each other, and we wonder why. Would you believe if we channel that energy was using in fighting each other, if we channel all that energy into the construction of basic infrastructure, into the adding value to our raw material before we export them, Africa will be someplace else. We will not be begging the outside world for help, for assistance, for this, for that. We will not be begging. We will be actually contributing. Today, we are dealing with this COVID-19, which is destroying lives and everything. Now, we are still, as Africans, we are begging for the vaccine to come from outside. We have scientists, we had the brains. In the country where I am, in South Africa, we had the facility to produce vaccines, but we have scientists. Why don't we get our scientists together to produce our own vaccines so we don't have to be waiting, begging for other countries to supply vaccine to us? Those countries, they give priority to their citizens first before they think about us. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers and sisters, time has come for Africans to work together and move our continent forward because, as I said earlier, we have contributed to the development of other continents. It's about time we concentrate on developing our own continent. And that's what our people are waiting to see. As the leaders, we have the obligation to take the bull by the horn and then build the Africa that we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir. That was opening remarks by Sir Ben Bogo, Dean Diplomatic Corps, of the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Africa. Note that the session is live on Facebook. Our next item, with a little bit of a change in the program, let me take this opportunity to welcome Commercial Break Made in Africa, Nicole Lariza. Nicole Lariza, the stage is yours. Our next item, Commercial Break Made in Africa, Nicole Lariza.
She's connected. I'm not so sure. Let me.
We see her. She's connected
Okay,
there.
I am here. I am
Okay.
here. I didn't get my name there. I apologize.
Okay. Go ahead, Nicole.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Nicole Nelson. I am the founder and head formulator of a company made by Cocoa. What we do is we're crafters of organic and natural products, which is formulated with ethically and which is formulated with ingredients sourced from Mother Nature, of which we source throughout Africa. I'm also the founder of a company called Cocoa & Co. SA. Cocoa & Co. SA is a manufacturer, wholesaler of natural products for whether it be private label, whether it be for any brand, startup brands who are looking to start their own ranges and wanting to do clean beauty or to focus on clean beauty. We've got an amazing distribution model. Because our biggest, one of our ethos is to spread wealth. It's very important to us that whatever it is that we make, add value, it contributes towards creating sustainable entrepreneurship, as well as, of course, also to create viable jobs and jobs that last. We are also looking at branching out and exporting into other parts of the world, particularly throughout the African continent. And I am very honored to be a part of these kinds of conversations because it really teaches me a lot and it allows me to see where the next best place is or what the next, where to tap into, what markets to tap into. Can you?
Yeah, we hear you, Nicole.
You hear me. Yes, so we've got, to give you I'll just tell you a little bit about, Made by Cocoa, which is the first flagship brand falling under Cocoa & Co. And Made by Cocoa has, really gained some amazing traction online. Just yesterday, I did some stats and we've turned over 104,000 Rand in online sales in the past year, which is an amazing milestone considering how, reluctant people are to spend on e-commerce platforms, particularly an e-commerce platform that they're not familiar with. We have launched our distributor model where we have distributors who resell our product. And that in itself also has, ultimately, we've got 3 distributors who are making some amazing passive income for themselves, one of which is well on her way to perhaps make this a primary income for herself. It sounds like small numbers, but we're big on organic growth. We're big on growing and making a change, but a lasting change, and not wanting to go all in and look as though we're doing amazing things only for us to reach or to decline as quickly as we started. And I invite anybody who's interested in any way, shape, or form to create their own range, whether it be in personal care, in natural cosmetics, in hygiene product, detergents. Absolutely, especially if it's made with if
Nicole got lost. Can we reconnect her? Nicole? Nicole, are you back live?
She
Oh,
says
yes.
the system
Nicole?
kicked her out. She's coming back.
Oh, okay. I can see it. Nicole, go ahead. Unmute her.
I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Nicole.
I'm here. Yes, so like I've said, I invite anybody who is interested in formulating a range to contribute towards our buying power model, because as we're looking to get all our manufacturing hubs, any manufacturing hub that we set up, whether it be my brand, which is the flagship brand, and any other brands, get it to 100% capacity so that we can replicate the model and ultimately take it as close to communities, into the communities as possible. And it's a lot to share. I will give Saul our profiles that he can hopefully share with everybody, and I will also share it in the group on WhatsApp, so that everybody has a better understanding about this model and perhaps where they believe they could fit in, whether it be through import and export distribution channels, or if they themselves are interested in creating a range made with ingredients that is ethically sourced from Mother Nature. Yeah. And with that, I'd like to also extend a thank you once again to Saul, who's been an amazing shoulder to lean on and a mentor. And of course, we're going to be giving away a Made by Coco hampers to the 7 keynote speakers, if I'm not mistaken. There may be more. And I hope that it serves everybody who receives it for a higher good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you for that presentation. I think we at Brandhill Africa, we pride ourselves in ensuring that we stimulate and enhance small business. The theme and the essence of today is about celebrating intra-Africa trade, and this is how best to showcase it as well. So thank you very much for that. You have support of Brandhill Africa, and you have support of all the delegates that are here. And thank you very much also to Ambassador Mpoko for the call to action that we need to fold our arms. We need to make sure that we don't fold our arms and we rise up and take destiny into our own hands. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for that message. And I'm sure that the diplomatic corps in general, especially the ones in Africa, since this celebration is about Africa Month and it's about enhancing intra-Africa trade, that we need to diversify our trade. Indeed, the elephant in the room is to say that if we want to trade amongst ourselves, what is it that we are trading amongst ourselves? And the diversity of our trade is very important and sacrosanct. And thank you very much that you made a clarion call all of us to make sure that we rise up and we take destiny to our hands. Agenda 2063 will not come by itself. It will come by us, private sector, business, civil society, academia, individuals taking up the stand and making sure that we promote the trade that we want and we achieve the Africa that we want. The aspiration of 2063 are not itself by its own. It's going to take us, civil society, and us, the individuals, to take it upon ourselves. And I believe that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is one of the stepping stones of ensuring that we trade amongst ourselves and we grow the business within Africa. That will come when the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce and Industry talk about the import and the export part of things. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, it is indeed my pleasure now to go to the experts, because of when we talk as individuals, we can put numbers there and everything else, but when you have experts' opinion that can bring the facts on the table, and then we can be able to engage far much better. The Q&A session will come later. you can always we will open for the Q&A so that you can post your questions. Without further ado, and as my co-program director has indicated, we are live on Facebook as well, so you can check us out there and on YouTube. So without further ado, let me welcome Mr. Francois Fauché, who is the Director for Growth Diagnostic from the University of the Northwest Business School, to share with us what is this animal called the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and what does it mean for us and how can it benefit us and how can we enhance for building intra-Africa trade. Mr. Fauché, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen, much appreciated. Stephen, I'm trying to share my screen. If you can perhaps just give me rights to share my screen so I can get the slides up, please.
Okay, I think, okay, I think I will let Saul just
I've
know.
just made him the host.
Okay, all right. Go ahead, Francois, can you share?
Let me try again. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Nope, not yet. I've just tried.
You are the host now. Let me see if I do it. Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, then it's me. I can say share. Yeah, you can go ahead. Are you able to share now?
Let me just check. No, that your screen is being shared at the moment.
My screen is being shared. Yeah, I see. Mr. Mulubi, can Mr.
Okay, let
share
me.
his screen? He wants to share his
I
screen.
made him the co-host.
Host. Okay. Mr. Mulubi is still connecting you, Francois, just so that you can share. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know, webinars is always a technical glitch now and then. Thank you for your patience. Are you able to introduce the topic in the meantime, Francois, while we're trying to sort you out as well?
Yes, of course, of course. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so, Stephen, speaking about the African Continental Free Trade Area and looking at some opportunities and also the relevance for potential post-COVID economic recovery from this new African trade agreement. It's absolutely fascinating if you look at the number of people over the last few years from so many different parts of the world, from so many different walks of life that have actually spoken and referred to an African trade agreement. And never in my life have I seen an African trade agreement make so much or get so much media and mainstream media attention, that is. So there certainly are a lot of expectations on this new trade agreement. Like the ambassador mentioned a few minutes ago, it's all about the implementation. There are some very grand plans under this new trade agreement, but without proper implementation, none of it's actually going to come to fruition. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Let's just see here.
Okay, I've just reclaimed.
Yeah, Francois is the host now. Yeah, share Francois.
You should be able to see it now.
Yeah, it's there we go.
Okay, excellent. Stephen, thank you very much. Saul, thank you very much. I'm going to get straight into it because I have to run at 12 o'clock, but we've got a full hour now. So as I've mentioned, I'm going to talk about the new free trade agreement, and we're going to dissect it a little bit and see what it means, not only for potential exporters out of South Africa, but mostly for all exporters from Africa. And how do we actually, I think the main question we're trying to answer here is how do we actually get Africa to trade more with itself? It really is not rocket science, but there are a number of barriers and obstacles in the way that we have to overcome. And I'm going to unpack some of them this morning. Sorry, there's a little bit of an echo on the line, Stevens. If all people can just ensure that they are muted so that I don't hear myself, back a few seconds later, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to start with the fact that the CFTA is actually a very ambitious African Union initiative. And I think we should not forget, and I'm going to share more of this throughout the next hour or so, that the CFTA is an African Union initiative. The CFTA does not stand on its own feet. It is very much, if I can say, almost a parent-child relationship with the African Union. And you'll see later on why that is actually important to keep in the back of your mind. So if we look at what happened in the beginning of this year, a very divided world coincided on the 1st of January this year. And what actually happened from a trade perspective is that the UK, via a very bungled Brexit process, eventually actually got to leave the EU formally at the end of last year. On the same day, on the 1st of January, Africa decided to come together. So some very different signals that are being sent to the other countries around the world when it comes to the UK's behavior versus to African countries' behavior. Of course, the proof is in the pudding. Africa would need to show that it can actually pull off the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. The CFTA has been very long in the making. It started more than 3 decades ago, where the Continental Customs Union was put forward in the so-called Abuja Treaty that the ambassador also referred to earlier on. The African Union, the AU, was in fact established with integration as its core objective another decade later. Then another 10 years passed and the AU Assembly adopted the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade, the so-called BIAT action plan and roadmap for the establishment of the CFTA back then. And then some more time lapsed, and eventually in March of 2018, we had an agreement between the African Union countries that was signed, and we formally started trading on the 1st of January this year. So it has followed years of negotiations and preparations, and recently we faced months of delays due to the global pandemic. What was supposed to be to start in the middle of last year was postponed, and we actually formally kicked things off in the beginning of this year. But before we carry on, perhaps just a brief share of some of my thoughts at a slightly higher level. If we sort of just stand back and we look at what is playing out here on the continent in front of us, what type of mindset should we preferably possess in order to look at these, this large potential that the continent has? And I think this is very apt to share this with you. And this is very much from a trade policy perspective, but also from a developmental policy perspective, is when we carry yesterday's thinking into today, we are in essence programming tomorrow to be like yesterday. So what this means is we have to change the way we do things today. And if we don't, then we are programming tomorrow to be exactly the same as yesterday. And if we look at the today's economic reality in so many parts in Africa, really is a function of yesterday's policy decisions. So if it's not looking brilliant today, it's because of the policy decisions that we've made in the past. If we want a brighter future tomorrow, then what we need to do is we need to change the policies that we actually make today. Just to remind yourselves in terms of the objectives of the new trade agreement, it's there to create a single continental market for both services and goods, not only for goods like it has been in the old days with trade agreements. It's there for the free movement of business people and investments across borders on the African continent. It's there to pave the way for the establishment of an African customs union. But I must just caution you here, this is many moons into the future. I would say at least 2 decades, if they're close. It's there to expand intra-Africa trade through better harmonization and coordination of trade liberalization. It's there also to create better trade facilitation regimes and instruments across the regional economic communities, the so-called RECs. And I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about these RECs in the next few minutes, but also across Africa in general. It's there to resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships and expedite the regional and continental integration processes. And then lastly, it's there to enhance competitiveness at both the enterprise and the industry level via opportunities for scale production on the continent, and to arrange continental market access, and to hopefully get to a point where we have improved reallocation of resources on the African continent. But it will be a very tough road ahead for this new trade agreement. I like this cartoon from the quite a lot, because I think it encapsulates and summarizes everything very nicely. There's the African Union cheering on the CFTA athletes, saying, never mind the obstacles, our all-weather track is ready for you. And you can just see the the sweat that the CFTA athlete is experiencing, because there are many hurdles, there are many obstacles, there are some wild animals lurking in the background, there's some crocodiles in the pond. And this really is not a sprint. This is not even a marathon. This is a couple of ultra marathons that need to be run, not only by one athlete, but by 55 different countries on the continent. I'm going to go in some detail in a few slides in terms of who has embraced this new agreement and who sort of is steered away from it. But this is a long-term journey. It's not a single event. Well, what can we say about the levels of African regional integration on the continent? If we look at a study 2 years ago by the African Union, by the African Development Bank, and by UNECA as well, and you read the first paragraph of that research report, it goes something like this. If prosperity, social cohesion, and human development are the destination, then regional integration is the path. So Africa is very much set, at least in terms of words, on increased levels of regional integration. And this is the correct direction for Africa to take. It would be great if we can see some more implementation wins along the way in order to actually strengthen the levels of regional integration that we have on the continent. From this very same study, what emerged is that Africa's least integrated country is considered to be also its youngest country, i.e. South Sudan. And Africa's most integrated country is considered to be South Africa. Now, we don't have time to go into the details of how they did it in this study, but suffice to say that they looked at 5 different pillars. They looked at the level of trade integration among African countries. They looked at the level of productive integration, also macroeconomic integration and stability, the levels and conditions of infrastructure integration on the continent, and lastly but not least, the ability for free movement of people from one African country to another. Perhaps just some context before we go into more detail. Remember that the promise, the driving rationale behind this whole new Africa trade agreement is to make it easier to conduct business on the continent. And this should be seen as the start of the journey, as I've mentioned, not as a single event. And we realistically should expect decades to go by until we reach something that resembles something like full implementation. The CFTA is part and parcel of a gradual harmonization of African trade and investment policies to facilitate much greater levels of intra-Africa trade and investment. It's not only trade, it's very much trade and investment, and almost literally trade in anything, including capital. The idea is to create one of the world's largest free trade areas, or so-called FTAs, if you measure it by the number of countries that actually are going to participate. Now, the quantum of the footprint is very impressive and fairly intimidating. The potential market size is in excess of 1.2 billion people, and the combined economic activity as measured by GDP is in excess of $3 trillion US. And this would create, hopefully significantly enhanced and improved business opportunities and jobs across the continent, while reducing at the same time the cost of some goods in shops and markets. And you'll see in a couple of slides why I refer to some goods and not all goods. Just be realistic in terms of what we can cover in about 45 to 60 minutes. It's literally only the tip of the iceberg. This agreement is very comprehensive, it's very wide, it's very deep. I'm going to share with you a few highlights only. Before we jump into more details, I just want to take one step back for one slide and just provide some global trade context. And what I mean by that is to share this great slide with you from the Peterson Institute of International Economics in the US. And they call it globalization is in retreat for the first time since the Second World War. And what they mean by that is to say that the level of trade openness in the global economy has actually declined since the global financial crisis emerged or sort of started in 2007, and that went on for a good about 18 months. But if you look at the levels of trade openness, or so-called the level of globalization, since the Second World War, where we were down at about 10% of global economic activity in terms of openness, we have surged in about 50 years to a level of 6 times that. And then we had the outbreak of the global financial crisis, the big squeeze on the bond market and on the housing market in the US, with large amounts of debt that has been created, especially at the consumer level, that many of the banks carried on their balance sheets. And since that, the GFC, the global financial crisis, we've reverted to levels significantly, or that represent significantly less globalization or less openness. So remember that when we talk about openness, globally speaking, the world is a less open place than what it used to be, 12, 13 years ago. And it's against this background that we must look towards the African Trade Agreement. It's a good time to have this conversation for Africa to trade more with itself, because it is getting a little bit harder for the rest of the world actually to trade with themselves. So what are the priorities of this new trade agreement? I think first and foremost, it's there to broaden Africa's economic and market space. Secondly, other priorities include also to address the supply side constraints that we face on the continent, to address the weak productive capacities that we face on the continent, and to also address the infrastructure bottlenecks that we experience in Africa. But it's more than just a free trade area. It's also a platform which can facilitate a process of inclusive structural transformation. It's there to contribute to Africa's Agenda 2063, as we've heard this morning. And lastly, it's there to progress Africa towards implementing the very elusive sustainable development goals. It's not going to be anything of a big bang approach. It will be done in phases of negotiation. Now, the first phase of negotiations include trade in goods and also trade in services. I'm not going to go through all the various aspects of trade in goods that are going to be addressed. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit later. The second phase then casts the net a little bit wider, and now we are going into the world that goes beyond goods and services. Now, phase 2 will step into the world of investments, i.e., capital crossing borders, competition policy, protocols on intellectual property rights, for instance, protocols on the movement of business people across borders, from one African country to another. I think a very important question to ask is what actually happened on the 1st of January this year, now that we say that we formally started trading under these new so-called trade rules. Well, first and foremost, 44 countries submitted their plans to reduce their import tariffs, and they are now able to trade goods under the new rules. But each country and regional bloc make their own plans, and eventually all this information will be hosted on the Africa Trade Observatory's new website. And I'm going to share with you, how to get hold of that, the new ATO website. So under the new Africa Trade Agreement, tariffs on 90% of goods will be phased out over the next 20 years, and more so for the remaining 7%, so that eventually, when we're all done and dusted with this, 97% of tariffs on all goods would hopefully be, completely tariff-free for trade among African nations. And as I've mentioned, this is done in stages. There is no big bang approach. And I think realistically speaking, it should take at least between 1 or 2 decades for this to come to full, or to bear some fruit at least. So has the price of goods in the shops actually changed? I think that's the million-dollar question now that we formally started trading under these new rules. And the short answer is no. For that to happen, taxes on imported goods must in fact first go down. And many countries have officially reduced their taxes. So some goods are eligible for lower tariffs, in fact, as we speak. But these countries first have to gazette their specific tariff changes before it can take effect. So not all countries that have offered so far to reduce their import taxes have in fact finalized their customs processes. And those include, procedures for presentation at the border, identification and clearance of goods, for instance. And one example, if we look at oranges that are imported from South Africa for sale in a supermarket in Kenya that currently at the moment attract a 25% tariff according to the Africa Trade Observatory website. So if Kenya were to remove this tax and all the required processes are then in place, the price of those oranges certainly could fall. Whether it would fall by the full 25% tariff reduction is a very good question. And I think it all depends on the complexity and the margins embedded in that little regional value chain to determine whether it will fall by the full tariff reduction or not. I think another important and vital question to ask here is that what are the average tariffs actually imposed on other CFTA imports? And in order to help understand the answer to that, I want to offer you another example. And answering this question, in essence, are African import tariffs really that high? This is a chart from the World Bank from a study about 2.5 years ago, where they looked at two types of variables for a number of countries at a particular point in time. And the first variable on the X or the horizontal is the imports from other CFTA members, the percentage of imports. And on the vertical or the Y then is the average tariff rate on those imports from the CFTA members. And you can see at the bottom right corner of the chart, Namibia and Botswana import almost all their imports come from South Africa. And they pay very close to nothing on those import duties to move the goods from South Africa into Namibia and Botswana. Of course, remember that they, together with South Africa and Eswatini and Lesotho, are part of SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, also the oldest customs union in the world. And once goods are imported into SACU, duties are paid if there are import duties relevant to those imports once they enter SACU. But once they move around from one country to another country in SACU, most of it happens with very little interference. If you look at the top left corner there, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Nigeria, they pay a little bit more in terms of the average tariff rate from other CFTA members, but they import significantly less from other CFTA members. So if you look at the average tariff rate here for all the countries, it's between 5 and 6%. I think it's hard to argue that an import tariff rate so well into single digits can be construed as particularly onerous or very high. So I think the key takeaway from this slide is that African import tariffs are not really that high. So if it's not really African import tariffs that are that high, what else is then preventing more intra-Africa trade from taking place on the continent? And in order to answer that, I think we need to look at non-tariff trade costs. That is when a structured approach is followed to convert non-tariff related barrier to sort of a tariff equivalent. And here was a study done by the World Bank a little bit more than 2.5 years ago, where they looked at what the non-tariff trade costs are in various parts of the world. And you can clearly see that Africa is much higher than Latin America. Now, if you ever try to move goods across borders within Latin America, you'll realize how incredibly challenging that can be. Compare that with Africa then, and it is even more challenging in Africa to do so. So it's not really tariffs that are preventing goods from going from one country to another African country. It really is a non-tariff trade story. I think we can safely reduce the CFTA to it's a non-tariff play. If we can address among ourselves, among the member states, the non-tariff barriers on the continent, we'll see a significant increase in intra-Africa trade actually taking place. I just want to mention one thing about enhanced competition, not only enhanced trade of goods. We do think that price reductions will be quite modest on goods, and particularly food and foodstuff and building materials, to give you an example. But we do think that there will be more pressure to reduce services sector prices with the introduction of greater competition via the CFTA. So we think there's more scope for services prices actually to decline than there is for goods prices to decline, because the tariffs on those goods are not particularly high. The prices then, therefore, of services like telecommunication, business services, banking, and finance could decline more compared to goods prices, we suspect. You may ask, well, why do we bother to talk about services? Well, the value of services as a percentage of economic activity on the African continent is very significant. Here's a chart from the World Bank's development indicators 3 years ago, and you can see that for more than half of those countries in Africa, services actually make up more than half of total economic activity in those countries. Usually people ask, but Francois, what are those services that you refer to? And in this instance, it's any activity that does not fall under agriculture, industry, or then manufacturing. What we know about international trade in services is that it is not nearly as well captured as international trade in goods. And apart from the fact that we don't have the same level of luxury in terms of the number of data points in terms of international trade and services, what we also know that there's significantly less of that taking place, especially among African states with trading with themselves. So what difference do we think it will make to actual traders? Well, it could potentially make a big difference to export goods from one African country to another. To give you an example, here is an extract of an interview from a case study that they've done with one particular entrepreneur in Accra. She's a fashion entrepreneur and she makes items with African prints, such as handmade laptop bags, handbags and pillows, and most of her raw materials are in fact imported. So the import taxes on her raw materials make the final product a bit too expensive actually to sell in Africa. The result is, her biggest export markets are in fact the US and the UK. You look at an extract of an interview they did with her name is Mabel Simpson, and she said that if I need to ship an item to the US, this is now from Ghana, it's going to be $25. But if I need to ship the same item to Uganda, it's costing her $60. So I think you'll agree with me, while we have this type of logistics pricing in place on the continent, it's very hard to argue that we'll likely see a significantly increased intra-Africa trade taking place. We need to reduce the level and improve the level of logistics competitiveness and reduce those prices of moving goods around on the continent before we can expect more trade to actually take place on the continent. What about larger firms? Mabel's company is a rather small company. I think the large free trade area is expected to attract more foreign and domestic investment, which then will foster industrial growth due to the large and seamless market for goods that is the ambition to create via this new trade agreement. But smaller companies should not be worried that they will not be able to compete with the continental giants and the multinationals that are already here and that are hopefully on their way, because the new trade agreement also includes a negotiation on protocol on competition policy, which will hopefully sort of level the playing field for all the different sized players. Now, this is not in place as yet. This is an ambition at the moment, so we need to get there via implementation and negotiations. The new trade agreement could also make it easier then for small firms to expand into neighboring African countries where they could find new niche markets. Of course, if they prefer not to do that, they can then choose to specialize in parts of the supply chain of the larger firms, the so-called global value chains around the world. But obstacles certainly do remain on the continent, like infrastructure, in particularly road, rail, customs processes at the borders, security concerns, quality and quantity, and ditto in terms of telecommunications. So I think it's probably proper to ask, why is the African Union so keen on a free trade area? And again, by means of two examples, I'd like to answer that. If you look, for instance, at Kenya, which has been a major flower exporter for many decades, but Nigeria continues to import their flowers from the Netherlands. So the Kenyan flowers are going from Nairobi to Rotterdam, from Rotterdam to Lagos. Another example, Nigeria produces palm oil. But palm oil in Kenya, for instance, on the supermarkets, are likely to come from Malaysia instead. So the idea behind the free trade area is to see Kenyan flowers on the streets of Lagos and Nigerian palm oil for sale actually in Nairobi. And an interesting fact, and a disturbing fact, in fact, is many African countries still trade more with their former colonial powers than they actually do with their own neighboring states. So what is the actual value of intracontinental trade taking place on the continent? Now, there are various studies that have been undertaken in order to quantify that. This is just one from UNCTAD over a 5-year period, where they found that only 2% of African trade is actually taking place within the continent. Now, is that high or is that low? If you compare it with other parts in the world, like the Americas, Asia, or Europe, you can see, especially compared to Europe, where they've literally within the EU erased sort of borders for all practical purposes, there's significantly more intercontinental trade taking place in those parts of the world. And I think what Africa should strive for is to make the borders, to create hurdles at the borders which are much lower and much more seamless to overcome than what we currently have in place. What are the main intra-Africa agricultural, or I should rather say export products? And they happen to be all within the agricultural space. Here are 5 commodities that are known to be the biggest traded amongst African members. And they are sugar, it's palm oil, and it's maize, and then 2 forms of tobacco, one in an unmanufactured form and one in a more processed form. You will find no complex products here, i.e. products that require a lot of beneficiation or a lot of different, as we refer to it in the literature, so-called person bites, lots of different skills in order to put those together. These are all very primitive sort of primary agricultural products. And therein lies the challenge in terms of diversification of industrial capacity within the African states. What can we say about the regional economic communities, the so-called RECs in Africa? If we just for one brief while step into the world of international trade law, we'll find that on the new Africa Trade Agreement, or in the new Africa Trade Agreement, there's a clause that states that state parties that are members of other regional economic communities, other regional trading arrangements, and then all customs unions, which have attained among themselves higher levels of regional integration than under this new agreement, shall maintain such higher levels among themselves. So what on earth does that actually mean, practically speaking? Well, what it means is that the new trade agreement formally recognizes some regional economic communities, some RECs in Africa, but do not recognize all the RECs in Africa. So which ones are the ones that are being recognized? Well, firstly, it's SADC, the Southern African Development Community, of which South Africa, of course, is part of, and the DRC. The Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS. COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, is also being recognized. Then there's the EAC, the East African Community, a very well-developed REC, as a matter of fact. They have, to a limited extent, free movement of people across borders, not among all their member states, but among some of their member states. You can cross an international border. You don't need a passport. You can do it with an ID card only. That is the ultimate. That really is where we want to end up. There's also IGATT, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is in fact recognized by the new trade agreement. There's CENSAT, the Community of Saharan States, the large one very far north. And then there's the smaller one also in the north, the last one being recognized, the Arab Maghreb Union, so-called AMU. But what about SACU? What about the Southern African Customs Union? Now, there are in fact 13 RECs in Africa, but only 8 RECs are actually formally being recognized by the new trade agreement. And some of these RECs in Africa think of themselves as customs unions or free trade area, but it really is only a SACU that represents that. And some RECs are more advanced in terms of regional integration, like the EAC, as I've mentioned. But SACU is not recognized as a REC by the new trade agreement. However, SACU does play a very important integration role on the continent. In fact, SACU dates back to 1910, and South Africa became a union. And here's a fact that's going to stun you, that of the 55 countries on the African continent, and remember SACU has 5 member states, SACU trade among them, its own members, among the 5 members, make up more than half of total intra-Africa trade on the continent. So 55 countries on the continent, 5 in SACU, less than 10% rather of all the countries on the continent makes up more than half of the intra-Africa trade. If you take this statistic and you expand that footprint to the SADC level, it actually goes up to 75%. So when we talk about who's trading with who, it's mostly the South trading with themselves in Africa in terms of intra-Africa trade. But SACU does fall within the ambit of that Article 19, Clause number 2 that I've mentioned. So it's not recognized as a so-called REC, but it is recognized for its status and its important integration role as a so-called customs union. It's just a wording there that was initially a little bit of a concern to us, but it is formally recognized. So you can sleep easy with regards to that. But when you put all of these things together, in terms of the number of different member states that belong not only to one regional economic community, but sometimes belong to more than one REC, what you get is a very complex net of regional economic communities in Africa. So you've got lots of overlapping REC memberships among countries. And this creates a very complex trade setup. And the border posts, unfortunately, at most of these African countries are not nearly as sophisticated as this complex REC membership that have been created. And this then results in less intra-Africa trade actually taking place. So this needs to be addressed if we, all border posts just need to be significantly sort of scaled up, or perhaps it's a combination of both, which is probably more plausible. I want to say just a couple of things with regards to the new institutions of the new trade agreement. Now, the functions of the new CFTA institutions include, and has now been expanded to include, political oversight and some policy direction measures, as well as technical guidance and assistance. And this is very new for the structures of the AU, because it's now moving into the world of international trade regulation and then to ensure compliance with multilateral trade rules. Now, the reason I mention this in particular is because this is not Africa's history. Africa does not have a history of following rules, especially when it comes to trade. And now the world has changed when it comes to trade within on the continent. So the jury is out to see who will comply and who will not. And just to refresh your memory, some of the 55 African Union members on the continents all still do not belong to the WTO as yet. And just to refresh you here, here's a world map of the ones in yellow that are not members of the WTO as we speak, and you can see there are a number in Africa. The challenge here is that those very member states have actually put up their hand now to be part of the CFTA. Now, the CFTA, because it's so comprehensive and so much rules-based, can almost be seen as a little or Africa's little mini WTO on the continent. And but the problem is some of these members that are not part of the larger WTO, of the actual WTO in the world, have now put up their hands to say, but they want to be part of the little mini Africa one. So we don't know how that is going to play out in terms of their trade behavior. So who is actually on board and who are sitting on the sidelines and watching the action? One way to look at this is to say that nearly all African countries do favor the new trade agreement. But some countries have made, or let me rather say this, is that countries have made varying levels of commitment to the new trade agreement. Now, up until very recently, 55, or 54 rather, of the 55 African countries have signed the agreement. But only 34 have actually ratified the agreement. Only 44 countries have submitted tariff liberalization proposals up until now. And the agreement then came into force at the beginning of this year. But please remember that there are no real obligations at present on the signatory nations. So the signatory countries are now involved in tariff rounds of negotiations. And African countries, at least the ones outside of the customs unions, won't be trading with each other free of import tariffs for a considerable amount of time. And the aim then of the first round of negotiations is to eliminate tariffs on 90% of the tariff lines, not on 90% of existing trade. And this is a nuanced difference, but it's a very important difference because most countries don't trade in most of these products at present because the economies are rather tiny, not well diversified, and there is trade, but there is rather limited trade. So what could be the potential increase in regional Africa trade if the CFTA were to reach some of its ambitions? And here's a study done by the IMF about 3 years ago, where they've modeled using a computable general equilibrium approach, the CGE approach, to say that if we were to remove all the tariffs among African countries, and versus we address infrastructure, logistics, credit, access to credit, a level of education, level of human development on the continent, what would have the biggest impact in terms of creating more inter-regional trade? And you can see here that the increase that a reduction in tariffs would bring compared to the increase that an improvement in the credit conditions and access to trade finance, for instance, would bring are vastly different. Yes, tariffs, the reduction of tariffs would certainly make an impact, but an improvement in access to credit would make a significantly larger impact. An improvement in the logistics, an improvement in infrastructure overall on the continent would make far greater, will have a far greater impact on an improvement in the in regional Africa trade. And then that's also where the efforts then, in our opinions at least, should be concentrated. So we also may ask, why did so many countries actually sign up? And I think, signing this new trade agreement was very much a political act with no immediate fiscal implications for signatories. Yes, yet I must concede that, in doing so, it has galvanized the continent and it has strengthened the foundation of trade integration in Africa. But effectively implementing the new agreement could entail huge costs, especially short-term fiscal adjustment costs for some of the smaller, more vulnerable countries. And at the moment, we have very much a win-win continental trade integration project narrative, out there. And I would hate for that to morph into something like a win-loss narrative, especially if the smaller countries would feel that they would lose too much fiscal revenue if they were to give up import tariffs. Of course, that is more perception than a reality, in my opinion, because if you start to open up your borders, if you start to open up trade, if you embrace the global economy to a far greater extent, you remove the obstacles in terms of participating in the global economy, your economy would grow much faster versus an environment where you do the exact opposite. And that growth in the size of the pie, would clearly compensate for whatever you lose in terms of import tariff fiscal revenues. I must just warn here this morning that the mainstream media has completely overhyped the anticipated effect of this new African trade agreement. As I've mentioned in the beginning, just before we started this morning, I've never seen a trade agreement, especially an African one, being talked about by so many people from so many different walks of life, from so many different parts of the world. And of course, the politicians have talked it up as well. But I think if we conclude on this slide, if the past is a prologue to the CFTA, the outlook is significantly less rosy. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we have to reach each other around the negotiation table first and agree and sign and then implement. And in order to see the actual benefits of the trade agreement. At the moment, it's all very much ambition. It's not integrated successes as yet. It's starting slowly but surely, but the pandemic, of course, is not making it any easier. But please do not think that some SMEs that we've spoken to over the last 2 years or so, that the minute we start trading, which we now have under the CFTA, that Africa will just miraculously open up and be extremely easy to conduct business in. It's a process that we need to follow. Just a couple of words in terms of the rules of origin and what we don't want to see happening when it comes to the rules of origin with this new trade agreement. We don't want Africa to be sort of a basket case and becomes a Chinese takeaway. And what do I mean by that? Well, firstly, proper rules of origin talks are very important, and those are happening as we speak. But the fear is that China may take advantage of this new free trade area. And this is a difficult aspect to monitor, people, given the lack of sophistication at many of the African border posts. And just to put in context here, what I mean by Chinese takeaway is that if there's let's say we have reached levels of increased integration, regional integration, it's easier to move goods from one African country to another. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, we are there, and one African country starts to import a lot of goods from China, and they don't add local labor and local value add to that, and then they simply move it on to another African country. That's not the idea behind the CFTA. The idea is for that to happen, but with lots of local labor, with lots of local value add, in fact, transforming that imported product from China into something else and then exporting that product to another African country now that it's easier. That's what I mean by proper rules of origin. Just very briefly, one note about the new institutions of the CFTA, and in this instance, it's about the new dispute settlement body. This is replicated the WTO dispute settlement system, but it's been sort of regionalized, if I can say that. The big difference between what we have in place right now versus what we've had in the past is that it's only state parties that will be able to bring applications against other state parties. So in one African government against another African government, there is no room for private party litigation under the new dispute settlement body. The reason I mention this is because Africa's history is not one of where one African government would sue another African government. Up until now, that has not happened in Africa. Africa does not like to do that. Let's see how this new environment, let's see how the African governments play with each other under these new set of rules. These are very progressive, a very rules-based multilateral approach to trade, which I think is a fantastic development, but we need to see the various member states embracing these new institutions and sort of sticking to the rules when they hit a snag. And trust me, when you liberalize trade, you hit snags very quickly and very often. The African Trade Observatory that I've mentioned, you can go to ato.africa, that's the URL or the website address. It looks something like this, the homepage. It was in beta until very recently. It was done by a sponsorship from the EU, and it is the ITC, which is the sister organization of the WTO in Geneva and Switzerland, that has done the development work with the Secretariat in Accra and Ghana. And this is a wonderful development. I can really recommend that you go to ato.africa, play around with the tools on the website. It is extremely valuable. It's only for trade and goods at the moment. It's not for trade and services, but it is really, really useful. And you can only, and it's free of charge. You can only, win by playing around with the tools that they've developed. Really, really useful and great to see this development having actually taken place. So, coming to the end, why do we think it will take a very long time for the new trade agreement to sort of come to fruition? The first one is when we talk about the free movement of people across borders. When we cast our minds back to what happened in 2010 with the World Cup here in South Africa, any African team that played well was supported by the rest of Africa. Then the euphoria of the World Cup sort of evaporated, and we've had some outbreaks in South Africa of xenophobia. It's going to be difficult with this type of approach to foreigners, especially from the continent, to get, I think, consensus around negotiations around the free movement of people across borders. Another one is when it comes to trade negotiations, the differences in sizes and complexities of production capabilities of economies certainly do play a role. And we are not all equal partners when we sit around the negotiation table, because some has more negotiating power than others. Of course, the CFTA agreement has been structured in such a way, it's on a quid pro quo basis, like most trade agreements are, but hopefully we won't see much of that. Another reason is why it will take a long time is because countries, many African countries on the continent have and continues to receive African or IMF assistance rather, and debt service relief due to the impact of the pandemic on their economies. You can see from this chart that there are now more countries in Africa that have received assistance since the start of the pandemic than countries that have not received assistance, of course, including South Africa. The first time since 1994 that we had to go to the IMF. Now, the reason I mention this is because their minds are in a different place. Their minds are in a place where want to restore stability in their economies first, before they can really pay sort of attention to this new trade agreement. I just think it makes the environment is very challenging at the moment for this to make real progress, although I certainly hope it continues to make progress. And then the last one, in particular in South Africa's instance, is that Nobody really cares whether the recession, prior to the pandemic was technical, was non-technical. It's difficult to reform in challenging economic conditions. If it's all going gung-ho and you're shooting the lights out from a growth perspective, it's easier to afford the changes. Of course, sometimes the counter is also true. Things have to be really dire in order to force governments to actually go through with some reforms and with some liberalization measures, at least in terms of the trade side. I'm just going to skip through this because I want to come to the last slide, otherwise I'm not going to make it in time. I want to mention one thing, and this is the concluding slide, is that we've had a phenomenal boom in raw material prices. We've had a phenomenal commodities boom since the pandemic sort of started. And of course, South Africa, just as one example, like many other African countries, is very much still an extractive economy, where we extract something from the ground, we beneficiate some of it, certainly not most of it, and then we export that. But what has happened in South Africa's instance with this particular commodity, i.e. gold, if we look at the annual gold production in tons, and where the top producing mines are these days in the world, South Africa does not feature in the top 10 anymore. Of course, we used to in the 70s and the 80s, when the gold was significantly shallower than what is left very deep underground at the moment. But it refers to the same point that the ambassador made earlier on. For us to benefit from the CFTA, for us to benefit from increased levels of commodity prices, which is currently the case internationally, we must produce, and we must produce enough. We must possess enough production of a high variety in order to have something to sell. Now, on the African continent, in many instances, if you look at what we refer to in the literature as the so-called complementarity index, we find that many African countries actually, some extract, some produce very much the same as their African neighbors. So why we have high non-tariff barriers, we also have a complementarity challenge to play or to deal with. And that refers to the fact that many of us make the same thing. So why would we go and trade with someone if we can, if we already make something like that? And that's the whole, it can take us back to the days of revealed comparative advantage and all these, all the theories around that in the literature, of the late sort of 60s and 70s. But the point I want to make here, and this is the concluding remark, Stevens, is that for African countries in particular to participate in not only in more trade but more intra-Africa trade, we have to improve our industrial productive diversity and capacity. And when we have choices in terms of into what we actually diversify into, we must choose products that are more complex, i.e. products that require more beneficiation as opposed to products which are more on the agricultural and the mining side. And if we do that, we know that over time from the literature, then the economies will become wealthier over time and have higher levels of, and enjoy higher levels of sustained economic growth in future. So Stevens, I'm going to conclude there. For the people that don't know me, we are very active on WhatsApp. We have a YouTube channel, very active on email as well. If you don't have my contact details and you would like to stay up to date with these developments, there's my email, there's my mobile number, and you're welcome to drop me an email or send me a WhatsApp or an SMS if you want us to put you onto the mailing list and if you want to stay up to date with African trade and investment related matters. Thank you, Stevens.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francois. Indeed, it was quite stimulating, and that is the essence of why Brandhill Africa is proudly associated with Growth Diagnostic and the University of Northwest Business School. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Indeed, it shows that there is much work that is needed moving forward to ensure that we reach our desired goal. And you have put us in the pedestal by showing us the necessary figures and as well as what we need to do. Because as Ambassador Mpoko said, it's about us a call to action in making sure that we come to our desired effects of intra-Africa trade. It won't come by itself, it will come by us taking action. And Brandhill Africa has taken that step forward to make sure that we have intra-Africa trade. We start by discussing amongst ourselves, we start by opening the networks, and we start by engaging one another to ensure that we promote and champion intra-Africa trade. And that is why we have partnered also with the diplomatic corps to ensure that we spread the message and we ensure that there is mobilization to the realization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Without further ado, let me welcome Mr. Pete Dwight from the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce and Industry, in order for him to show and also make inputs from a business point of view to ensure that what we are talking about, we can walk the talk. So I would want to welcome Mr. Dwight to share with us in terms of what Mr. Fauche was talking about in terms of beneficiation, in terms of diversification, in terms of exports and imports. And I think that is what we are here about. So without further ado, let me allow Mr. Pete Dwight to share from a business perspective. Mr. Dwight, the floor is. Let me also, before Mr. Dwight come in, also maybe recognize the SADC Parliamentary Forum, which has joined. So you are welcome as part of the broader network of all the stakeholders and role players that we are invited. Mr. Dwight, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Program Director Stevens Mokgolapa, the Dean, Diplomatic Corps, Your Excellency Ambassador Mpoka, all ambassadors, the Chairman of Brandhill Africa, Mr. Molebi, the Director, Growth Diagnostic and Lecturer at the Northwestern University, Mr. Francois Foucher, Business and Civil Society, as well as Brandhill Institute for Public Diplomacy, Mr. Stevens Mokgolapa, Program Director. We have listened to our previous speakers, and something that stands out is that the time for implementation is right now. We have at the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is situated in Pretoria, right in the middle of all the embassies represented in South Africa, and most of Africa's diplomatic corps are within Pretoria. We have taken hands with Brandhill Africa, and we have established a forum. And within the next 10 days, Mr. Stevens Mokgolapa will ensure that all ambassadors in the region will take hands with a forum to be established. And the main objective of this forum is to enable reciprocal business between Africa and South African business people. The Chamber this year is 130 years old, and many of the ambassadors have already sent trade missions to South Africa and vice versa, and they know and understand how this concept will work. This will enable all business people in Africa, if they wish to do business with South Africa, or vice versa, that they can join a home, which is the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce and Industry, whereby they will be put in contact with the right business people. Be that any type of business, pharmaceutical, exporting perishables, and any commodity you can think of. The Pretoria Chamber of Commerce and Industry have expertise on board that can point you in the right direction. Also, as far as the tariffs are concerned, the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, is within 2 kilometers from the home of the Pretoria Chamber. So what we want to do is we invite you all to come to the Pretoria Chamber, and from there we will then point you in the right direction and ensure that reciprocal business is done and that you actually meet up with the decision makers. I myself started a business in Zambia a couple of years ago, and if there was no chamber to assist me, I would have still been battling to get to the right people and the decision makers. So the chambers of commerce and industry within the various African countries play a major role in this, and we are connected to most of them, and we wish to welcome them back to the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce and Industry with Mr. Stevens Mokgolapa, which will be taking hands with Brandhill Africa or Brandhill Africa, and we will ensure that whether it is a trade mission or trade delegation coming to South Africa or South Africa going to a trade fair abroad, that they are accompanied by top business people from South Africa. Program Director, I thank you for the opportunity, and the time has started. It is now to move forward and to start this reciprocal business. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ditoit. In true style of business, you have summed it up well and said what needs to be done. It's time to move forward. It's time to implement, because at this point in time, we are talking about implementation. That is what everything is all about at this point in time. It's about walking the talk. And we are looking forward as Brandhill Africa to join hands with the business community in Pretoria as the hub of the capital city as well, together with the diplomatic corps. And I think that is why we made sure that the diplomatic corps becomes a part of this celebration and a part of this inaugural and very important webinar, to ensure that we continue with doing inter-Africa trade. Without further ado, I would like to, we're gonna take a few minutes so that we can allow the Q&As to come through. And in the meantime, let me welcome Mr. Themba Mabena, just to give us a few words while we are looking at the setting up of Q&As, because Q&As shouldn't be that much. The presentation of Mr. Francois Fauché we're going to share with you. It's going to be widely available, especially for the diplomatic corps, Ambassador Mpoko. The presentation will be there for distribution to the diplomatic corps to ensure that it reaches all our diplomats and ensure that we build on, because of this is not a once-off exercise. We will be making it a yearly thing in terms of the Africa Month, but there are other webinars that we will be setting up with the diplomatic corps, either individually from their different embassies for their specific purposes, business purposes, and also generally for the diplomatic corps as well. So it is a building of those relations henceforth from now. And I think the symbolism and the importance of having such a webinar today it's sacrosanct and it's paramount because of what it does. It entrenches those relations. And that is why we have engaged a business sector and we've engaged academia so that all these things can be added together and gel together. And we've added the diplomatic corps and we've added civil society and individual entrepreneurs because of in the main, it's about enhancing intra-Africa trade in the true spirit of what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area has emancipated and has envisioned. So without further ado, Ipeleng, let me call on you, Ipeleng Kwadi, my co-director, to call on Mr. Themba Mabena to share a few words for us while we are setting up the Q&As as well. To you, Ipeleng.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mokhalapa. It is indeed a very informative session. Trade is key to Africa's economic growth without any hesitation. I'd love to call Mr. Themba Mabena for our vote of thanks. He's the CEO of Mbuduma Business Solution. Mr. Mabena.
Good morning, good afternoon actually, ladies and gentlemen. We are very privileged and honored that we've managed to have our bi-monthly conference, and I would like to actually thank everyone, but in particular, I would like to follow the protocol. Firstly, I would like to thank the ambassador, Ambassador Ben Gogo, the Dean of Diplomatic Corps, and Ambassador of the Democratic Republic of Congo in South Africa. I would also like to thank our panelists, in particular all the other ambassadors, all the other ambassadors that have participated in the session. And the rest of our panelists that I'd like to thank in particular is Nicole Nelson for a very wise with regard to the Cocoa and Coal South Africa. And I would also like to thank Francis from the University of the Northwest Business School. He's the director of the diagnostic. Pete Detroit, I would also like to thank you for your extensive contribution as the president of the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce, for which Mbuduma will also be extending their invitation to you as well. Most importantly, I would like to thank Brandhill Africa for their coordination of this session. It has been very informative and critical point where we all meet as Africa to discuss intercontinental trade. This has been a very fruitful and a great exercise, and I believe that thanking all of you that have participated is actually the most important thing to do at this moment. We believe that going forward, we'll be able also to be meeting and engaging on these topics as well. But I would really like to thank every one of you, and your participation has been very greatly appreciated, and we're looking forward actually in the future to engage with you. And back to you, Mr. Stephen Mokopa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mabena. Thank you very much from Mbuduma Business. Thank you very much for your inputs. I think we have exhausted our list of the speakers. And if you recall at the beginning of the presentation, because of time, our chairperson and CEO of Brandhill Africa requested that he give time to others for them to be able to present, because we were conscious of time, seeing that we have started 15 minutes later. So without further ado, let me give our chair and the CEO of Brandhill Africa, P2I, to give us a few words before we go for the closing session. And let me also appreciate the type of comments and chats that you have sent within our chat group and the Q&A. Obviously, this is a active and an action-orientated type of a webinar. And we will be taking all your inputs and comments, and we will definitely be directly responding to you on that front. So the call is for action and less talk. It's not a talk shop. We are not running a talk shop. We are running an action shop, because we are dealing with business people, we are dealing with diplomats who've got limited time and who wants to invest their time quite effectively. So without further ado, let me give you Mr. Molobi to share a few words of your presentation that you omitted earlier on. The floor is yours, Mr. Molobi. Unmute yourselves, unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you go.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Program Director. Let me say that you are not going to have a Q&A session because Francois had to dash into another meeting. But those of us who are in our AfCFTA network group, in fact, there are two groups now, please send your questions. We have noted some of the questions already mentioned here. We will re-divert them to the WhatsApp groups, and Francois will be able to respond to them. But also to say that we will be distributing his presentation, and we will also share with you the video links to YouTube and Facebook of this entire seminar. But just to say that as Brandhill, we define ourselves as a competitive identity and public diplomacy group. We are saying competitive identity in the sense that we support local manufacturers and producers to brand position their products so that they could be able to compete successfully with all the imported brands and also in foreign markets. In 2019, the Brand Leadership Group, which is headed by Tebe Ikalafeng, conducted their annual brand survey that found that only 20% of the top 100 most admired brands in Africa were homegrown. This worried me, but it became worse last year when the number came down to 13%, which means we are only embracing and affirming only 13% of the top 100 most admired brands in Africa. The 87 are foreign brands. And this worries me because even though we are talking about Africa having a market of 1.27 billion consumers, those consumers will still continue partaking foreign brands instead of buying our own local brands. So as Brandhill Africa, we are looking at dealing with this anomaly where we say our people should begin to embrace our own home brands and consume them. Because once we consume them, then those companies are becoming sustainable and profitable, and therefore they will be able to employ many more people and in a way contribute to the fiscus, which means governments will then be having the ability to be able to afford providing social services to all our people. We are also looking at mobilizing foreign direct investments into infrastructure projects. And as we speak, Brandhill Africa is sitting on about 120 infrastructure projects, not only from South Africa, but from Mozambique, from the DRC, from Gabon, from Ghana. And we are saying that all those people who are having infrastructure projects, whether it's be in oil and gas or low-cost housing or smart cities, do reach out to us, and we could look at how we can mobilize investors for your projects. We have partners in London and in New York who are ex-bankers, and they are well connected with investors across all over the world. So do reach out to us. There's something very worrying for me that I need to indicate, and perhaps it explains why we are meeting today as Brandhill Africa Institute. Brand Finance, which is a reputable research company, has just released their Global Soft Index 2021 results. And in there, they are only showing that only 3 African countries have made it in the top 50. Egypt is ranked at 34, South Africa is at 37, and Morocco at 48. And if you were to read our editorial comment of our news portal, Jambo Africa Online, which was published on Friday, we are talking to problems that continue to bedevil the continent, particularly even South Africa. The issue of xenophobic violence is doing injustice to our image as a country. And then we need to go all out there, speak to our people to begin to say, if you embrace the integration of Africa, that begins first and foremost with free movement of goods, services, and people across the entire continent. And the only African countries that made into the top 100 are Algeria at 74, Nigeria at 82, Ethiopia at 83, Tunisia at 84, Cote d'Ivoire at 86, Zambia at 87, Cameroon at 88, Ghana 93, Uganda 94, Kenya 96, Tanzania 97, Senegal 98. So we are not doing very well as a continent because we are positioning ourselves as the last frontier of development. All other continents are interested in us, but until we begin to affirm ourselves as a continent and to invest the necessary resources required to change the misperceptions of all these continents have of the world, we will continue to struggle, and we will continue to affirm foreign brands, and we will continue consuming all those brands that are not doing very much towards developing and growing our economies. Thank you to Stephen Mukhalapa for having organized this webinar, and we hope to see you in the next 2 months, since these are biannual seminars which are building towards our annual conference, which will be held on the 7th of December this year. The conference was launched last year in December, and it will continue as an annual conference. Those of you who are not in our 2 WhatsApp groups, do share with us your mobile numbers, because engagements are continuing every day between entrepreneurs from all over the continent. And we are using those as an affordable network platform for entrepreneurs from across the continent and across the globe, especially even those who are in the diaspora, for us to continue having discussions with us and to support us in opening market access for our products and services across the world. My number is 083-635-7773. Do send a blank message and we will be able to add you into our WhatsApp groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Molobi. I would want to, at this point in time because of we are a company that is building networks. I would like to welcome and acknowledge the SADC Parliamentary Forum, which is represented by Mr. Shweni Kurasha. It is one of the institutions that we are working with. Intra-Africa trade will not be realized alone. We need multiple sectors and stakeholders, and the Parliament is one of those institutions that can assist in terms of fast-tracking the legislation and implementing some of the protocols that are needed to facilitate trade, not only in the SADC region, but everywhere in the continent. And we've seen with the input of Ambassador Mpoko when he referred to the issue around what needs to happen and what happened within the SADC, where the AfCFTA emanate from and where it's at. So can I allow the SADC Parliamentary Forum to share a few words with us, and then I will do the final closure. Mr. Kurasha, the floor is yours, representing the SADC Parliamentary Forum from Namibia.
Thank you very much, Chair. Pardon me, I won't be able to put on my video because of connectivity limitation, but I wish to convey greetings from the Secretary General of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, and thank you very much for the invitation for SADC Parliamentary Forum to take part in the meeting. Indeed, Chair, trade does not take place in a vacuum, and the point you raise in terms of the role of Parliament in facilitating the creation of enabling legal framework through ratification of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, it becomes very central. But even what is more important, Chair, is the context where we are coming from a scenario where our countries are battling with COVID. So any trade that we have in mind is part of the post-COVID recovery and reconstruction. And when we look at the COVID pandemic, evidently there was a disproportionate impact on various segments of the population, including in particular women, girls, and young children. And any trade that we have in mind post-COVID, as part of the post-COVID recovery, must be one that is deliberately tailor-made to benefit the women, the children, the girls, because they have been affected more by the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at the issue of intra-regional, intra-Africa trade, there are various regional and continental instruments that are in existence that would require ratification and domestication for them to facilitate the movement of goods and people. One has in mind the SADC protocol on free movement of goods, free movement of people. It is one protocol that hasn't been ratified by many countries in the region, many of the member states, for various reasons, because it is within the sovereign right of member states to decide which instruments to ratify and which ones not to. But the effect of the matter is, if we do not prioritize the ratification of such instruments, it means that the movement of goods and persons remain constrained. There are also projects such as the one-stop border post projects, which have been approved for over a decade ago, but we have witnessed a quite slow pace of their implementation across the member states. Obviously, it's a matter that is between the two neighboring states that share borders, and that matter needs to be given consideration. When you look at the fact that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is not going to replace the regional arrangements, but is going to coexist side by side with the existing regional arrangements in terms of trade. What it means is that we need to relook at the regional framework and reprioritize ratification of those instruments that will facilitate the ease of doing business. Otherwise, the African Continental Free Trade Area will come and go, or will be like any other of the trade agreements that we have signed that has not significantly facilitated intra-regional trade and inter-Africa trade. And for that reason, we will need to continue to have conversations with parliaments and parliamentarians, because they have an important role in making sure that all international law, for it to take effect, it must be domesticated through the ratification processes, depending on the legal system in each of the respective member states. So at this point, I wish to submit, Chair, and appreciate the fact that you allowed SADC-PF to participate in the meeting, and we look forward to further engagement where we can share specific and pointed issues that we could give priority to if we must facilitate intra-regional trade. We look forward to having conversations with business. The relationship between Parliament and business hasn't been as robust. We remain with our doors open, and we are willing and ready to engage with you, business, as an important player, particularly when we are having conversations of the post-COVID recovery and reconstruction. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Kurasha, from the SADC Parliamentary Forum. As I said, the Brandhill Africa is not working in isolation. For us to achieve the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, it's going to mean a multiple role players and stakeholders coming together and making it a reality. And SADC-PF is central and critical because, as Kurasha says, there are regional instruments that need ratification, and there is also the AU instruments. So all those things need to work in synergy with one another. So thank you very much to all the participants. I think we have registered over 100 participants in this webinar, which is quite a success. And we are quite humbled by the response that we have received. We have recorded it live on Facebook and YouTube, and the presentation will be available to share. As the chair has already said, that we've got the WhatsApp group. As you know, the diplomatic corps is a different set of entity that we will deal with on a separate note because it's got protocol issues and state security issues as well. But let me take this opportunity firstly to thank my co-program director, Ipileng Kwadi. Thank you for the work that we've done together in making this a success. Let me thank Ambassador Mpoko for his contribution and our call to action in terms of walking the talk. The time of talking is over. All we need to do now is implement, implement, implement. And that is what Brandhill Africa is there for, is to make sure that we go through the implementation phase and stop the talk shops. Let me also thank Ufenze for her rendition of the poem in making sure that the youth that we have in Africa is well represented. And there is hope because of moving forward. It will not be ourselves alone that can champion the cause, and we need young people who can do that. And thank you for the rendition of the poem that you did in tribute to Africa. Let me also thank Nicole for making sure that we groom the business homegrown. We work in the talk as Brandhill Africa because of we showcasing that we are making linkages between small business and big business, and that is what it's all about. Nicole was here representing a small enterprise, an entrepreneur in her own right, and we've got Pretoria Chamber of Business that represent medium-sized to big-sized business. So it's a collaborative effort moving forward. Let me thank also Francois Fauché for giving us an expert opinion and give us all the statistics and what we have and the exploitation that we can have with the use of the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Thank you for giving us that expert opinion, because of it gives us a base on where to start from and move forward. And I think the most important thing is about diversification and beneficiation of African business to ensure that intra-Africa trade comes to the fore. And that is the essence of what Brandhill is about. As the chair has said, we facilitate trade and investment within the African continent. Let me also acknowledge and thank Mr. Peter Wade from the Pretoria Chamber of Commerce for sharing with us practical steps that needs to be taken moving forward in ensuring that there is harmony and synergy and there is implementation, because of in the end, it's going to be you business people who are going to facilitate trade amongst the African countries, and how so best to do than with the business chamber and the embassies together joining hands with Brandhill Africa as a continental African company and a multinational company that can facilitate trade, import and export within the African continent. Thank you very much, Mr. Ditoit, for that. Let me also thank Mr. Mabena for sharing a few words in terms of recognizing the contributors. And let me lastly also thank the SADC Parliamentary Forum for being represented, because for them it's important. They are doing model laws that regulates legislation and business within the SADC region. And they are very important that we have them as part of this, because business, you don't do it in isolation. There are legal prescripts that you need to follow. And how best do we do it without having the legislative arm of government with us? Because the executive has already laid down the law in terms of the protocols and the ratification of those protocols. But the most important is about the ratification, which happens within the Legislative Assembly. And we need to move with synergy moving forward. So thank you, Mr. Kurasha, representing the Secretary General of the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Lastly, let me thank Mr. Mulobi, the chairperson and CEO of Brandhill Africa. Thank you for arranging and hosting this important webinar. In the main, it was about showcasing the Africa as a business destination and as a trade destination, and in celebration of the Africa Month, because from the 1st to the 31st of May, the traffic in Africa in terms of celebrations, with a build up towards the 25th of May, which is the Africa Day. But, you know, choosing in true Tswana style, you know, the direct translation would be the last shift to eat is the one that eats the most. So we are quite thankful for choosing this day as the last day of the you know, of the Africa Day celebration. And this is not a once-off exercise, as the chair has already alluded, that it's a build-up to the bi-monthly webinars that we are hosting with different sectors and different stakeholders. And this one was specific for the diplomatic corps. So thank you very much, sir, for you know, your visionary leadership in this instance. So with that, and I would want to thank again our diplomatic corps who have made time to come here. We know that time is very of essence and important to you. And thank you very much, and happy Africa Month, and see you soon. Thank you very much. Yeah.